Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So we're starting a new series today, and what we'll be walking through is really an overview of the Pentateuch, or Penta meaning five. It's the 5 books of Moses, or what is referred to in the New Testament as the law. So when we think of the law, we have a tendency to just think of the commands that Moses gave, which is what it is. However, the books of the law begin in Genesis and go through the end of Deuteronomy. So you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those 5 books, the writings of Moses, make up what both Old and New Testament writers understand as the law. Now, the law can't really be divided up into different aspects, like, though there is a ceremonial aspect and there is a sacrifice aspect and there is certain moral aspects of laws and all that. When Paul is dealing with the concept of the law in the New Testament, it's not broken up into these chopped up pieces, in a sense. It's not like, well, we don't do the ceremonial law anymore, but we do the, the commands or whatever. And so people have done that over the years. They've tried to divide up the law so that it ends up people accept certain aspects of being under Moses' law, because it's been divided up in that way. However, if you go through the New Testament, you can do it very easily with an online search in like Blue Letter Bible, or if you have eSword or any Bible program that's searchable. Just go into the New Testament and then look at the law and then look at the context of each time it's brought up. It's never broken up into different aspects. It encompasses the entire law, right? So when Paul says we're not under law, he's not just saying, well, you're just not under the ceremonial aspect of the law. No, the covenant was all the law. Now, there are moral things that carry through, right, from Old to New Testament, but those moral issues are always moral or immoral. All right. For example, murder is always immoral. We saw that prior to the law in Genesis 9, right? People weren't allowed to murder people. Adultery is immoral. Thievery is immoral. Lying is immoral. And though these are aspects of the 10 Commandments, the 10 Commandments from Sinai were not given to the church. However, 9 of the 10 commandments were given to the church. The 4th command, which is the Sabbath day, was not a command given to the church. It was actually a command specifically to Israel because it was the sign of the covenant of Moses' law between God and Israel, the Sabbath day. So as we go through, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to give you, without delving in too deeply, an overview of these 5 books. The reason that it's important to understand these 5 books is because as you get into the other books in the Old Testament, you move beyond Deuteronomy, you get into Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, Chronicles, and throughout, the prophets, whether it's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, which are major prophets. The other ones are the minor prophets because of their size. Daniel is a major prophet. So as you go through them, and then, you have 70 years that Israel's in captivity, they come back, and then you have a couple of other narratives, right? You have Ezra and Nehemiah. Esther is sandwiched between Ezra chapter 6 and 7, and then you have 3 prophets. They are minor prophets, which is Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So they are all after the 70-year captivity, those 6 books. Now, the importance of understanding all this is because everything that is dealt with by the prophets, in the later narratives after Deuteronomy, after they move into the land through Joshua and everything, all of the interactions between God and Israel is related to these 5 books of the law. So, though most of the commands come out of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers and Deuteronomy, we're really not getting much for commands out of Genesis, but the law itself, I mean, none of the others. Exodus doesn't make sense without Genesis, because you don't know how Israel get into Egypt, who they are, why they exist in the first place, and why God's going to take them out. Okay, so they all tie together. So these 5 books, they function as a unit. They're important to understand because, like I say, the rest of the Old Testament refers back to them. When Israel is judged for their disobedience, it's disobedience to the law of Moses. When they're disciplined, when God is angry at them because of what they're allowing or the idolatry or whatever, that's all against the laws of Moses, right? Moses provided a functioning, almost like a constitution for their nation, and each of the leaders needed to make sure that they were following this. Now, there are 3 different groups of leaders as we get further into the nation of Israel. They had civil leaders, which were kings, princes, and the like. They were supposed to adhere to Moses' law. We'll see that when we get to Deuteronomy 17. And then you have spiritual leaders, which are the priests. The priests were supposed to essentially be the Bible teachers. They were supposed to make sure the Bible was taught to all the people. Now, again, though we won't get to the book of Joshua where we see the cities of refuge, they're made reference to in Numbers, but the cities of refuge were 3 cities in the land west of Jordan, Jordan River, 3 cities on the east, because Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh were outside the land. So basically, these 6 cities were places that if somebody committed manslaughter, they killed somebody by accident, they could go to one of these cities. There were priests there, and they would be safe there. People could not take vengeance on them. And there were 48 cities that the priests, right, the Levites, that they lived in throughout Israel. So they were kind of strategically located all over. And this gave access to people, ideally for Bible teaching and guidance, because the priests were supposed to teach the Bible, which for them is the law, right? Now, obviously, they began to add narratives and prophets, but even the prophets, though prophets, talk many times of things that are going to happen in the future, much of what they were dealing with was how Israel was either failing or being successful in relation to their obedience to the law. So prophets weren't always foretelling future events. Prophets also foretold what was existing truth, which is the law, the 5 books, and then how Israel was doing in relating to what was revealed to them. Okay, so there's a lot that's going on, but there's no way to really understand the Old Testament without understanding the law. And there's no way to understand fully the New Testament without understanding the law, because the New Testament refers back to it. And when Paul is making a distinction between Moses' law and the covenant of grace that we're under today. If you don't know what the law is, you don't know what's being distinguished. Okay, so we need to have at least a decent working knowledge of what the law is, so that we can understand actually like the Bible in some form of context. So as we move forward here, the outline is going to be simple. I'm going to go through the law, each of the 5 books, okay? And we will jump into some aspects here. So, like I said, the law is Genesis to Deuteronomy. Moses is the author, and this is from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. That's the ISBE on the bottom. And so they say Moses wrote, in other words, who is the author? The idea of writing or of writings is found 60 times in the Pentateuch. It is definitely recorded in the writing purporting to be by Moses, 7 times that Moses wrote or was commanded to write. So then you have Exodus 17:34. You can read them, number 17. And frequently of others in his time, right? So the Deuteronomy and Joshua references. So we see that Moses was commanded by God to write, which is why we have the books that we have. In the middle here, pick up Joshua at the great convocation, that's a meeting, at Shechem for the taking of the covenant, wrote these words in the book of the law of God, right? Joshua 24. Thus is declared the existence of such a book, but 25 years after the death of Moses, right? So you can compare whatever that it references there. It is thus clearly asserted by the scriptures as a fact that Moses in the wilderness, a little after the Exodus, was writing books. So Moses is the author. He's the one that wrote the 5 books. Jesus refers back to him in Luke 24, okay? And so we also have here from the Genesis record, it says Genesis was written by Moses. This has been the uniform tradition of both the Jewish scribes and the Christian fathers. Genesis is considered to be the first book of the Pentateuch, the others being Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And all of them together taken as the law, Hebrew Torah, that's the word for law, Torah, of Moses. This general view was apparently accepted by Christ himself. And then he quotes Jesus in Luke 24. At the beginning of Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them, this is on the road to Emmaus, in all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. These are the words which I spoke unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms concerning me. So those are really the 3 main divisions for the Jews in the Old Testament: the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And so the law obviously contains what Moses wrote, and that's why he references Moses. So again, Genesis was written by Moses. Jesus was clear on the subject, right? In John 5. He says, do you not think that I shall accuse you to the Father? This is at the end of John 5, to the Pharisees that were harassing him for healing the man at the pool of Bethesda. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, in other words, the first 5 books, how will you believe my words? So he made the comparison there. And that's the logical comparison. So as we look at Genesis, we have an overview of Genesis that is pretty basic, right? We have the creation of the world and the human race in chapters 1 to 11. So we get history, which is literal history, literal, grammatical, historical, That's the hermeneutic we use when we look at this, and we remain consistent with that hermeneutic through the Bible. A hermeneutic, or the hermeneutics, is really the study and science of Bible interpretation. We use a literal, historical, grammatical frame of reference for Bible interpretation. So when I read the Bible, I read it in a literal way. Now, that just means a normal way, the way I would read anything else. When I read the newspaper, that we don't have the paper newspapers anymore, if I'm reading the newspaper and it says, somebody robbed a bank, in a town near me or whatever, it means somebody robbed a bank in a town near me. Okay. I mean, that's what it is literally saying. And that's what they mean, because they're trying to tell you something that happened. Right. They use figuratives and metaphors and all that in so many writings, but that's all part of understanding something. Normally that's literal. That's within a literal framework. Well, these books were written in a historical context. Well, we have to know what that is. Otherwise, we won't know what the background is that they're actually writing to. Like, what is the issue of their writing? Why are they writing it in the first place? Is there a problem? Do they need guidance? Like, why are they writing to these people, right? Grammatical. It's written using words and sentences, and the words mean what the words mean, and the sentences have structure. And this is about as normal as you can get. Anything other than this is abnormal. That's the point. Okay. So we need to understand, when we read the Bible, you read it normally. Anything other than that is abnormal. Okay. How you would look at anything. So we have creation, right? And this is the first 11 chapters. The universe and the earth are created in the beginning, prepared for man. Man and woman, they're made in God's image, and they're in innocence. They haven't sinned yet. Okay, that would be a dispensation. That's really the first dispensation, which means that it's a period of testing that man is under. They only have so much information. They're at the beginning of the race, and God gives them one command: don't eat of the tree. We saw how that worked out, but this is a time of innocence, and the tests that they were under to demonstrate whether they had faith, they failed. And obviously they eventually came back to faith, but the point is that that's how we plunge the human race and the environment and everything else into the corruption that it's in today. We then have the first prophecy of the Bible in 3:15 with God's plan of redemption. So man sins, but God has an answer to the sin. And it's all pre-planned, right? In Acts 2:23, Peter says it was according, Christ's coming and death on the cross and resurrection was according to the predetermined counsel and foreknowledge of God. God knew what he was going to do from eternity past. He knew man would fail, but it plays out in time. And the first prophecy is the seed of the woman, talking about the Messiah, the Savior, will crush the head of the serpent. So that was done at the cross when our redemption was secured, and Jesus will return to finish what he has already completed as far as our redemption, but in time he will put everything under his feet. We next have, after creation, we have a flood judgment. We have demonic activity with unbridled wickedness, starting in Genesis 6. This is also a dispensation because people do not have any laws to live by. They're living by their conscience. And so this is the test. But the unbridled wickedness shows that, again, they are failing the test. Okay? This demonic activity, the sons of God, and coming into the daughters of men, and producing, the Nephilim, or the fallen ones, These are what Satan tried to do to corrupt the human race, and then God had to, in his grace, take Noah and his family, and then they were brought through the flood. So Noah is removed prior to Enoch is removed prior to the flood, which really comes into types. So Paul teaches us in 1 Corinthians 10 that, there are examples in the Old Testament for us, and we're supposed to follow them. We're supposed to utilize them. Now, a type, for example, when Stephen was before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 8, he said that Joseph was a type of Christ and also Moses. Okay. How is that? Well, types work in a very basic way. When you're trying to, a type is an example ahead of time. So, for example, how is Joseph a type of Christ? Well, Stephen tells us in Acts, he says that God raised up Joseph to deliver Israel, right? The fathers. Now, he delivered Jacob and Jacob's family. There were 70 people that were brought down to Egypt to survive the famine so that they could be secure, multiply in Egypt, and then God could bring them out through Moses, the next deliverer, okay? So both Joseph and Moses were used to deliver Israel and preserve them. However, initially they were rejected by their brethren. Joseph was rejected by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt, which God used to secure their redemption in a sense, ultimately. And Moses was rejected by his brethren because, he one day found an Egyptian fighting with a Jew. He killed the Egyptian. And then the next day, found two Jews fighting, tried to break it up. They said, "You're going to kill us like the Egyptian." So Moses was rejected by his brethren also, and went to the other side of the desert in Midian, come back 40 years later, and God used him to deliver the people. So you have two men that are rejected by the Jews, but yet brought back to deliver the Jews, okay? Well, Jesus is the same. He's the ultimate deliverer, right? These are examples, but they're examples of the Messiah. The Messiah was rejected by Israel, but ultimately he was the one that secured their redemption, the ones that would believe. And, and that's where we are today. Israel is in partial blindness until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. But Noah is... Enoch is a type of the church. He is removed prior to the judgment. And then Noah is a type of Israel that goes through the judgment. And we're talking about the tribulation, right? So Enoch was taken out prior to the flood. The church will be taken out prior to the tribulation. The Jews will go through the tribulation, and that's where they actually turn and repent. Noah was kept secure through the flood, that judgment. And then when he gets off the ark, God establishes human government. That is the next dispensation. So, quite simply, God says to a man, now there's only one family, okay? And it's interesting because it's Noah and his family, his wife and his 3 kids and their wives. And God says, look, Noah, you can eat what you want, okay? There's no food restrictions. And, I'm going to put the fear and dread in animals so that they'll run away. But man is made in God's image, and no other human has the right to destroy that. In other words, to take their life in this world away. Now, obviously, it can happen by accident and all that. That's not what we're doing. We're talking about premeditated murder where somebody decides, I'm taking their life. And so God said, if they do that, then their blood needs to be shed. And that's not 2 murders. That is then defined as justice. Because what they're doing is they're stepping into a realm where only God makes the decisions. God can make a decision to remove somebody's life in this world because they never really die to God. When they go into the next life, it's not like they disappear to God. As a matter of fact, they're always there to God. Whether they end up in heaven or hell, they will always exist and be there in some aspect of relationship with God. The ones in hell obviously separated, the ones in heaven joined to him through Christ. So it's important that we understand that this human government was God telling a family, the head of this family, Noah, how he wanted things managed. And which means that the establishing of a society comes from a family, right? A normal husband and wife and kids family. So we have really, we're looking at 4 families here. Noah establishes how the other families, with the authority of God, are to function. And then obviously his kids and wives, they would continue to, grow their families. And then as society builds, somebody has to manage it. God gave that to Noah, so Noah passes on the management of that, and this is where human government starts. So, afterwards, we get the Table of Nations in chapter 10, and these nations are the foundational names that are used through the rest of the Bible for geographic locations. The reason it's important to understand this aspect of it is because oftentimes you'll read of places that are being dealt with that have different names, like today. Like, for example, Iran up until 1935 was called Persia. Well, it's not called Persia anymore, but the Bible will refer to it as Persia, okay? And even areas up, around Turkey and the Baltic states and Russia and all that, they still maintain the same names in Scripture as they originally given here in chapter 10, because chapter 10 shows the division of peoples throughout the world. 10 and 11 work together. And what we end up with is Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which are Noah's sons. Shem, which the Jews will come out of, right? The Semitic line. Shem's offspring is really in the Middle East, okay? And eastward in that way. Ham is in Canaan, the land that Israel ended up taking over, and down into the African continent in North Africa. Japheth ends up being up really northwest and becomes Indo-European. So, my ancestors are from Sicily and Italy, so obviously you work it back far enough, and I come from Japheth, okay? So, but this is established, and then it explains the division, and then in chapter 11 it explains the reason for the division, which is Nimrod and the Tower of Babel judgment. So it's at the Tower of Babel judgment that the tongues are divided, the people groups are broken up so that they can't continue in that attempt to get above the water. The tower is going to get them high enough so that if God sent another flood, which he wouldn't, because he gave a sign in Genesis 8 that he would not judge the world anymore with a flood, with the rainbow, because the water canopy that was around the globe collapsed, and then now you have just kind of cloud formations and different weather patterns. And when it rains, because of how it works in the atmosphere, you can see that it diffuses the light, breaks up the light spectrum, and you can see a rainbow. Well, that didn't happen until it rained, and it didn't rain until the flood. Okay, up until the flood, there was no rain. The earth was watered with a kind of like a spring, or I guess a natural sprinkler system, if you will. And then there was humidity in the air because of the water that was above the atmosphere at the time. So God gave a covenant in the rainbow that he would not do that. However, Nimrod, who led this rebellion, we learn about him in chapter 10. Chapter 11, they're building this tower, and the tower ultimately is to worship the zodiac, right? The constellations out in the universe, and the unity in this idolatry needed to be broken up. God wanted them spread out and multiplying. He did not want them isolated again. Okay, so he broke them up. He changed their language. So people divided at the tower. They went with the people they could understand to different areas. They migrated out. And we know scientifically, just from how biology works, that within a couple of generations, you have whatever the dominant characteristics are genetically in those isolated groups will start to come out. And that's why people look different in different areas of the world. And God divided their languages so that they sound different, okay? And that's why people speak differently in different areas of the world. So as we continue, we then have the creation of a nation, the Hebrew race, in 12 through 50, right? So we have God's covenant people, right? The Jews, starting with Abraham, right? He got him from the Ur of the Chaldees in chapter 12. He's chosen to father a nation, and he says those that follow you need to be circumcised. Well, circumcision is the sign of the covenant, okay, with Abraham, that a person is genetically connected to Abraham, and that they are under the covenant of promise, which is also a dispensation. Then the circumcision shows that they are connected to Abraham as God is creating the Jews, okay? So these promises that God makes to him in chapter 12, land, seed, descendants, if you will, redemptive blessing. All the Gentile nations will be blessed through Abraham, which develops into that it is a further movement of the promise from Genesis 3:15 with the seed of the woman. So this ultimately works through information that we get through the law, right? The 5 books. So we know who the Messiah is. And then there's obviously prophecies added onto it later on after the 5 books. But so we have these promises in Genesis 15, they're ratified into a covenant with Abraham, okay? And so Abraham has Isaac now. Obviously, he has Ishmael, the first one, through Hagar, the maidservant, that they pick up down in Egypt when they went down there because Abraham was afraid because there was a famine in the land that he was in the land of Canaan. So he went down to Egypt, shouldn't have gone there, but picked up a maidservant. He and Sarah couldn't have children, so he ended up having a child through surrogate parenting, mothering with Hagar, Ishmael, and Ishmael was not where the promise was going to follow through. God said, no, Abraham, it's going to be somebody from your body, and Sarah is going to have a child. Now, she couldn't have children, so they figured she would never be able to have children, so they gave up on it. Ishmael is Abraham trying to help God out. Didn't work out well because the offspring of Ishmael has constantly been an aggravation to this day against Israel. They fought in the house, right, where Sarah got upset. She said, Ishmael is always persecuting Isaac, and I want him gone. So God had Abraham have Hagar move out. Now, God took care of her and her offspring and all that, but there had to be a separation made because the child that was born after the flesh, which is Ishmael, was constantly harassing the child of the promise, which is Isaac. And Isaac was born when Abraham and Sarah were, Sarah's in her 90s, Abraham's 100, and they couldn't have kids at that point. So this is a miraculous conception here. He's the child of promise. The Abrahamic covenant continues through him. Okay. Then we get to Jacob. Isaac has 2 kids. He has Esau and Jacob. Esau is the oldest. Jacob comes out second, right? They're twins, though they don't look the same. Holding him by the heel. So they call him heel catcher or Yaakov or Jacob. All right. And the covenant continues through Jacob. Jacob is the line that the Bible follows. Esau was not interested in spiritual things, though he was the eldest, which means he would get the family blessing. Jacob wanted the blessing more than Esau, and Jacob apparently was a good cook, cooked a good meal. Esau came in from hunting, said, "Give me some of that food. I'm starving to death." Jacob said, "Okay, I'll trade you the food for your covenant blessing." And Esau said, "Fine. What good's it going to do me if I starve to death and I can't survive?" Esau only wanted what he wanted, when he wanted it, at the time that he wanted it, because that's what the flesh is. And he's certainly a type of the flesh. Now, I will say Jacob was really, in a sense, no better, though Jacob did believe, but it took a long time for God to break Jacob of that self-centered reliance that he had. So the plan of God was to move to Egypt, to bring the nation down there. We actually get this in chapter 15, where God says to Abraham, you're going to have an offspring, and through your offspring, a nation's going to develop. I'm going to send them down to Egypt for 400 years. He says, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full or complete. In other words, I'm going to give the Amorites, who were living in the land of Canaan at that time to repent. Everybody knew about Abraham. They knew about his God. And they ended up, they didn't get any better morally. They get worse. And they ended up doing nothing but murdering children through Molech worship, and with the idolatry in the land. And God never judged nations outside of Israel for failing to keep the law, because the law was just given to Israel. But God did judge them for idolatry, which was not allowed, and that was evident from the Tower of Babel. Okay, idolatry is not going to be allowed, and they would be judged for it, because it's essentially, that's what the Tower of Babel, that judgment was there because of idolatry. And so God was going to give the people in this land, these Amorites, all this time to repent, which they never did. But God eventually brought Israel in. But he did tell them, hey, when you go in the land's going to vomit them out because of the wickedness that they're performing. But if you guys do the same thing, the land's going to vomit you out too. All right. So Jacob prophetically blesses Joseph's sons in chapter 48. They're all in unity now. Jacob and his kids, go to Egypt. They meet Joseph. Joseph realizes his brothers can now be trusted, and Joseph wants Jacob to bless, for his blessing to be on his sons. His sons are Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh was the firstborn. Ephraim was the secondborn. Jacob actually changed that. Joseph tried to correct him. Jacob said, "I know what I'm doing." He actually crossed his hands when Joseph sat the kids on his knees. And he said, Ephraim is now going to be firstborn, because though Manasseh was born first, the designation of firstborn, though most of the time it is the one that's born first, can be changed because it is really inferring a preeminent position, okay, that individual has. So Ephraim ends up being the firstborn because ultimately he'll be a larger tribe, and prophetically he ended up being the largest tribe of the nation. When the nation divided later on, after Solomon's reign, there was 10 tribes that went north, 2 that stayed in the south, Judah and Benjamin. But the northern 10 tribes were always called either Israel, because it was the majority of the tribes, or Ephraim, because it was the dominant tribe. So anyways, Jacob confers the blessings on Joseph's sons. Jacob prophetically blesses his own sons, and when he gets to the fourth one, to Judah, that's the one where the Messiah is going to come out of. He's going to be the one that rules. So that's the Messianic line. And, like I got the references down the bottom here to dispensation and the sign of the covenant, just so that we can stay consistent. All right, so this actually went a little longer than I expected, but so we have Genesis in there. We'll kick off with Exodus next time, but hopefully this is instructive. You may want to read through Genesis as we go through this. It'll maybe help you with some of the overall if you're just doing a quick reading plan. But either way, I hope that it'll be beneficial for you. So until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.